based on your study of this problem, which is years long, probably decades at this point, who do you think is more informed about this lead problem in Milwaukee? Do you think white people are more knowledgeable about this, or do you think black people are more informed about this?
I feel like it's hard for me to answer that because I've heard different sides of the story. So, for example, we have suburbs in Milwaukee where majority white people live. We have what we call Whitefish Bay, which sounds like the name, Whitefish Bay. And people in those neighborhoods will talk about how they get letters in the mail to say that, oh, you have lead pipes, and, this is what to do to mitigate, or, this is how to get them removed and things like that. From the black people that I've talked to, I've heard about black people being informed in that way in Milwaukee that, oh, your home has lead pipes, getting a letter in the mail. But, Whitefish Bay, that being a suburb and that being separate, still like near Milwaukee, but technically separate, they might, have different procedures on how they inform their people. Yeah, I think it's hard for me to gauge who is more informed. But I would say that black people are a lot more informed than people may think, and there are a lot of community organizations making sure that black people are informed about lead poisoning.
In my opinion, stand by her work. Natia Taylor, I am front and center, got the documentary film to prove it, in helping black people specifically grasp this crisis. Job, and just for the record, I cracked up laughing. I was so glad that I was muted so I didn't cut a fool on the program. Whitefish Bay, Wisconsin. I'm going to guess that our guest, Miss Taylor, she did not spend a lot of her formative youth in Milwaukee frolicking in Whitefish Bay with a population. No. So, hedging my bets there too. 14,553 people in Whitefish Bay. 3.6% black, and they're all in prison, I bet. 84.2% white. This would qualify what I said already. Racially restricted region.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Sundown town. I do not think I'm going to visit Whitefish Bay Village. Contraire, Gus T. Contraire. Context of white supremacy. Gus T. Renegade in for another broadcast, hopefully to share constructive information with non-white people, victims of white supremacy. People classified as white do not need to listen to the cows. That said, Gus T's counter-racist research project in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, thankfully, safely concludes. Gus T back in 206 Seattle. All my fingers and toes, no major loss of property or life. So can just share, what did you learn? What did you do while you were in Wisconsin? One thing, I did indeed visit Whitefish Bay almost immediately upon visiting Wisconsin. I visited Whitefish Bay. Now, most of this was because I stayed in Glendale for the first couple of weeks that I was there. This is not Milwaukee. It's just a teensy bit north of Milwaukee, but if you, and Whitefish Bay Village is kind of in the northeast corner of Milwaukee next to Lake Michigan. So from Glendale, all you had to do was literally walk a block or two east, and then a teaspoon south, and bang, you are in Whitefish Bay. So I had literally, it was so much a full circle, meant to be visit for me to go back to Whitefish Bay at the end of my trip for a lecture. Just, man, right and exact for everything. So what we are about to hear is the second to last day that I was in Milwaukee, night before I go to get my flight. There is a talk at the Harry and Rose Sampson Family Jewish Community Center in Whitefish Bay. The talk is by Thomas M. Jacobson about his newly released book, Underdog, Against All Odds, The Fight for Justice. Now, I was supposed to see Mr. Jacobson the day before, that was Tuesday, at the Wisconsin Black Historical Society. I'd seen the advertisement for this at the American Black Holocaust Museum, thinking, oh man, I didn't even know about the Wisconsin Black Historical Society. I'll get to go check it out. It's another museum, get some information on racism. Whoopee. I get there early. The event's supposed to start at 6 p.m., so I get there early. Am, looking around, see what's going on. Nobody's there, no one inside, place is all locked up. I take a few seconds. There's a library directly across the street, public, from the museum. So I go to the library, try to gather, my thoughts. It was actually really hot that day. It was trending towards that massive heat wave that hit Milwaukee. So I go sit in the AC, kind of think, process what's going to go on, hydrate. I call, no one answers. So I sit, think, maybe they canceled, maybe they rescheduled. I don't know. I'm looking online, a little disappointed because I wanted to see this dude. He's talking about Jeff Dahmer and all that. Jeff Dahmer is right on the front of the book. And this guy, Thomas M. Jacobson, suspected racist, think he's a white dude. And his book is about his experience in the Nazi Germany concentration camps as an infant. Then it talks about him moving to this region, United States, and him being a student activist, so-called, at the University of Wisconsin Madison, and then him coming to Milwaukee to fight against racism and be a part of the so-called civil rights movement. And then the last third of the book is his effort on behalf of the victims, family members of Jeffrey Dahmer's victims, to get them restitution for all of his crimes and such, and even against Netflix for that movie. That's the last portion of the book. So that's why I'm all excited. Racism. Let's go get to it. Now, I'd spent the day before this talk at the University of Wisconsin Milwaukee, and I had been at the American Geographical Society library. I had got bunches of maps on the whole state of Wisconsin, Milwaukee specifically, and even Whitefish Bay specifically. And then even I had got maps showing the racist covenants in Whitefish Bay, where families, sometimes whole groups of families, got together, sometimes by the dozen, to say no niggras, put in their covenant and all this. And so I had really been looking at all this in great detail, had been reminded of James Lowen's book Sundown Towns while I was sitting at the UW Milwaukee Library. And the white librarians at the Geographical Library, they knew all about the system of white supremacy racism. They knew all about the racism in Whitefish Bay, and they knew all about James Lowen's Sundown Towns, which, because of this trip, I think I've had to move that book all the way up to number 2 on my book list. And we read that book 8 years ago in the Catherine Massey Book Club, and it continues to pay massive dividends. I literally was pulling that book out in the library and going through and looking at my footnotes, and yes, that book mentions Whitefish Bay as a racially restricted region. I even read some of that book at the lecture. Incidentally, if this lecture had remained, or if I had caught it at the Wisconsin Black Historical Society, there would have been lots of black people, I suspect. I don't know. That's just a guess. Probably some other differences. It would have been in Milwaukee as opposed to being in Whitefish Bay, and they had a pretty snazzy, racially restricted region set of hors d'oeuvres. They had wine and almonds and cheese, and you know how white people can do it up. But I think if this had been at the Wisconsin Black Historical Society, there probably would have been no wine. Just a guess. Sobriety would be best. Anyway, so Gus T gets to this event. I can only say because it was full circle, and I mean literally, my hotel when I first arrived in the Milwaukee area was probably less than 1 mile from where this event took place at the day before I flew out. Less than what, like if I had remained at that hotel, which was my original plan, I could have walked to this event leisurely. And because I recognized where I was by the time, it was time for the event to come, and when I saw it on the map, I got so arrogant. I said, I hopped out of my Uber like 2 blocks early, like, wait a minute. This place is next to a Trader Joe's, which it is, which I knew as soon as I saw it on the map, like, oh, I know where this is. Like, I'm not confused or lost or nothing. I hopped out early to get vegan chocolate and caffeine because I didn't know they were going to have wine at the event, so I'm going to take my snacks in and clown. I get in, there's one other black person there out of an entire room, and it was filled. If I had to guess, I'd say they had easily over 50 people, maybe even, at least 75. All the rows were packed. One other black person. I did not expect there to be any black people there, and I did not care. It was going to at least be one. 206 in the house, Gus T. But there was one other black dude present. He did not give me no fist bump or no high five or, I'm so glad to see you, my black brother, and I thought I was going to be the only one, and come here and let's do the secret Negro handshake. None of that. The energy was almost, what are you doing here? You're not going to sit next to me, are you? I got a good thing going here in Whitefish Bay, and ain't no Gus T gonna mess up nothing for me in Whitefolks Bay. I didn't sit near my black brother. I sat on the front row by myself, confident. Now, you'll hear him do his talk, do his lecture. In my opinion, he gives very short shrift to Jeffrey Dahmer, which I didn't understand. I mean, we are in Milwaukee, ground zero. Who doesn't want to hear about Jeffrey Dahmer? He spends way more time talking about Nazi Germany and all that, even though he was an infant and can't really have any direct memories of all of that. But he spent lots of time talking about that. I guess know your audience. Maybe he was at a Jewish community center. And then he spent, I guess, the second most time talking about his so-called civil rights activities in Milwaukee. I had done so much research, and I'm not an expert on Milwaukee history or Milwaukee racism per se, but I had done enough research that when he started bringing up specific cases and people, I knew who he was talking about. Now, one of them, or at least for me, one of the most important, he referenced white man, racist suspect, and said, hey, not all white people is racist. Father Gropey was out here with the niggras in Milwaukee, marching for so-called fair housing, and don't be mistreating the niggras, and get the police to back up off of the niggras, and don't you use your nigger knocker on my nigger friends. I know enough about Milwaukee racism and what it means to be white that I had already researched Father Gropey. Do you know what happened to Father Gropey? You can't be white and ignorant about racism. Father Gropey was excommunicated from the Catholic Church. They don't even excommunicate you if you rape a child. But Father Gropey was excommunicated. You know what he ended up doing? Driving a bus. I didn't even see no white bus drivers in Milwaukee, but Father Gropey, after they booted him out the Catholic Church, driving a bus in Milwaukee. Act like you don't want to practice racism if you want to. Dr. Welsing would get on me so tough if I messed around and didn't say it. She would say Semite. And she would talk about that being, these are miscegenated people out of the continent of Africa. Man, Mr. Jacobson, I am saying racist suspect. I think he's accepted as white, and I think he's able to practice racism. That said, I told you I sat on the front row. He sat directly in front of me. The immediate thing that came to my attention, Semite, this dude has a touch of the tar brush. Like, wow, he looked so much darker. Not that he looked like Leroy or a black person, but he looked substantially more melanated than all of the people in the room who would be classified as white. I think he racist suspect, white man, but oh wow, I could see what Dr. Welsing was talking about in so-called Semite with this fella here. Still a racist suspect. That said, with all his talk about Nazi Germany and the Jews, I did think of Jonestown, White Knight, and I thought, man, we are in Wisconsin, and this whole area, I think they had a lot of migrants from Europe during the 20th century, German and Polish. Like, I would kind of be stunned, especially what I just said, Jonestown in Indiana at that time. I would be surprised if there wasn't a strong German presence in Wisconsin during the 1900s, and maybe even a pro-German, pro-Nazi German presence in Wisconsin during the 20th century. Maybe even now, but certainly during the 1900s. But be that as it may, we will get to it. You will hear Gus T. This talk was only an hour, which I also thought was kind of niggardly, being it could have been at least, I mean, you got wine. We're comfortable in Whitefish Bay, and it's summertime. School is out, so what's the big deal? They started at 7 p.m. They could have went to 8:30 because they had a Q&A. They could have easily done 90 minutes. That would have given them more time to talk about Dahmer and us more time to ask questions. It may have been, oh, Gus T, front and center. We're going to wrap this here thing up quick. Anyway, but if you listen, you'll hear Gus T get my questions in, and you'll hear Mr. Jacobson behave like a typical race soldier. I was going to buy his book just for the experience of it all. He was giving a little discount for us in person, but oh man, once he opened his mouth to answer my question, that ended all that. But you will hear me read from James Lowen's book about Whitefish Bay, racially restricted region, the racist covenants, all that. And even at a certain point, I turned to look at the crowd because it was so overwhelmingly white. 2 niggras in the house. They giggled when Mr. Jacobson tried to suggest that we made all this progress, and you can't be having restrictions on Negro neighbors now. I just turned and looked at the crowd, and they sat there and ain't nothing funny about no racially restricted region. White folks came to chat it up after this was all over. Hopefully we'll have follow-up from some of the white homeowners of Whitefolks Bay who can talk about the racially restrictive covenants in their deeds that say no niggras or Ethiopians. This is Gus T live from Whitefish Bay, Wisconsin. I literally had just ran from the facial recognition technology meeting at City Hall in Milwaukee to come to this meeting at the Jewish Community Center in Whitefish Bay. I don't know if they're going to have facial recognition cameras in Whitefish Bay. I doubt it. Cows, Gus T in Wisconsin. Here we go.
Voyage of the Dams, many of you have seen. You were a student activist at UW Madison, which So you went there in 1959, is that right?
That's where it first started.
So I was also a student activist there, but in 1965.
Okay.
So-
You did Vietnam.
So we did the Vietnam thing. So, and you're really part of Milwaukee and, in fact, national history. I mean, you are a civil rights lawyer, and some of the stories in here, you represented Father Gropey. You represented families that were destroyed by Jeffrey Dahmer. That is such a local story, and just so much more. This book is just full of, a very full life. So the first thing I wanted to ask you, though, the name of this book is Underdog. So explain to us why this title.
Well, underdog, you're the disadvantage. And that's why I always represented the disadvantage. Poor people, minority people. So I called the book Underdog, Against All Odds, the Fight for Justice, because those are the kind of cases I was involved in. I don't think anybody thought that Father Grappi, for the kind of things he got arrested for, that you were...
And he was a priest who got arrested for civil rights engagement.
There was an underdog again in terms of whether he was going to survive the kind of hostility that he was facing here in Milwaukee during the time that he was being active. And it was pretty much the same kind of client base that I represented. Daniel Bell was just a youngster up from the South. Barely couldn't read, didn't have a driver's license. He was shot by a white police officer in the back of the head and basically murdered, and they covered it up by planting a knife on him. So with that kind of a base, those kind of cases, we were fighting for what I consider the underdogs in society. So that's how the name got to be on the book.
Oh, fantastic. So you had mentioned that there was a passage that you wanted to read.
I do. I'll give you just one little passage from the St. Louis.
We'll talk more about the St. Louis episode.
And it wasn't just my family. I was on St. Louis. Mm-hmm. I was probably one of the youngest passengers.
You were what, 6 months old? Or?
Yeah, I was basically 6. When it left, I was 6 months old. In fact, there are many survivors of the Holocaust left. I think in the whole world, there's only 250,000 survivors of the Holocaust. And then when you talk about on the St. Louis, there were 937 passengers. I don't think there's more than a dozen or two of us left alive today. So I talk a lot to Holocaust museums, to young people about the St. Louis, because it's such an important story, because there's so few of us left that could give it authenticity and tell it from really a perspective of we were there. It happened to us. Holocaust survivors are deniers are everywhere with the way the right wing is operating today. They deny all these kind of things. So the truth has to be told by those that have the credibility to tell it. And there's not going to be a long time there. We're going to be around to be able to tell you that story. Let me see. I've had such a good demand for my book, the one that I had the bookmark in. I gave it away today. I'm shocked that today alone, I think we got rid of 25 books so far, which is really amazing when you think about it.
It's a bestseller.
We've had a wonderful day. We started on WNOV this morning at 9. We were on WTMJ at 11. We had an hour and a half interview with the Cat Times. Dave Zweifel this afternoon. He's going to do a big article for the paper, and now we're here tonight. So things have really been happening and going well. I'll read the passage a little later.
Okay.
Let me kind of just make a few brief remarks before you cover some of the questions you want to ask me. This is really there's 3 main themes in the book. There's the St. Louis and that story. The second part, when I was in college, I was very active in the civil rights movement. I was elected to head of the University of Wisconsin Madison Civil Rights Council. That's how I got involved in all the civil rights activities. And I can tell you a cute story about that. The reason I got elected, because I wasn't from New York, and I wasn't a communist. So they could put me out front for them and say it wasn't all those communists from out east that were raising and causing trouble for the locals in Madison when we were out demonstrating.
Just a little aside, when I was a student there, so I was later than you, there was this whole quota system that the state legislature enacted, and they to reduce certain out-of-state students. Like if you were from Wyoming, there was no restriction. If you were from New York, you know what that means. You know.
Yeah, and we guessed why the reason was that they had that quota policy, because they were targeting Jews.
That's what I mean. Absolutely.
So we go on from the St. Louis story, which is the first part of the book. The second part of the book goes through what I did at the university, more of the active kind of things that I did in the civil rights movement. Then we're going into what I did as a lawyer in Milwaukee in the civil rights movement, and we end up with the Dahmer stuff. So I'm going to briefly touch on those three areas when I cover his questions, because I want to really leave it up to you to ask the questions of those three kind of themes, what you're interested in hearing about.
Yeah, so we're going to go for maybe from another 25 minutes or half an hour, and then, you know, so we're going to ask for your questions also. So I wanted to start with the St. Louis. I mean, we could probably do it without a reading, although it would be nice to hear some of it.
It's a very short couple of paragraphs. Go ahead and ask me the question.
Well, no, I had a number of questions. I wanted you to explain what happened to your family that you ended up on the St. Louis to begin with.
All right, so
maybe you should just first.
Well, let's start with a brief overview of what happened on the St. Louis as far as my family is concerned. Starting in 1933, when Hitler took power, that's when the Jews started getting in trouble in Nazi Germany.
Where was your family from?
We were from Bamberg, Germany, and my father's family, they were in Pillau, Germany, and my mother's family was from Insterburg, Germany, and I was born in Bamberg. Both of my grandparents were owners of commercial establishments. One owned a department store, and one owned a haberdashery store. 1933 already, there was the boycott, and it affected both of them because that's what the Nazis targeted as soon as Hitler got into power. So what happened, basically, things escalated. 1935, you had the Nuremberg laws. Then you get up to Kristallnacht in November of 1938.
So what was that?
Kristallnacht, you know, that's the night of the broken glass. That's when the Nazis, the Gestapo and the SS, they all hit the streets and they destroyed all the Jewish businesses. And they went after Jewish homes, Jewish people. But out of that came a decree that all the Jewish men from 16 to 60 were to be arrested the next morning. And my father knocked on the door. My mother answered. I'm 6 months old. She got me in her arms. There was the SS. You've got 10 minutes. We were here to arrest my father. He got arrested. He had 10 minutes to get whatever he could take with him. Off they marched to the concentration camp. That's where he was in. And he was there for 2 months. Conditions there, you know, they shaved all the prisoners, tormented them, beat them, and it was just, he was never the same after his experience in Dachau. He got out after 2 months, but Nazis told him, you know, you have to get out of Germany in 90 days. That was the policy initially. Hitler was willing to let the Jews go. But you know what the problem was? Nobody wants the Jews. Nobody wants the Jews. You know, who's going to take us? We applied for a visa to the United States in 1935. We did not get, our number didn't come up until November of 1939. We were on that list for 4 years. And of course, after my father, we had to get out of Germany in 90 days. We had to find someplace we could go. Cuba, there was a corrupt guy that was giving out tourist visas. We got one. We didn't know it was corrupt, that it wasn't any good. 900 of the passengers bought that kind of a visa. We got them, with a package with the boat that was the St. Louis. And basically what happened, we got on that boat, and it was a great voyage. We had a great captain who was terrific, even though we had all kind of SS people on the boat, working the boat. But this captain was really, when we used to have our Friday services on the boat, he'd cover up a picture of Hitler. That's how great he was as the captain. But by the time we got to Cuba, they wouldn't honor those tourist visas. And so we never could get into Cuba. That was the reason they wouldn't let us in. So we had to leave Cuba.
And the Nazis knew that was going to happen in advance, right?
Well, I don't know.
That was probably like a PR thing that they, you had good accommodations, right?
I haven't heard that, but
you don't remember that. But
no. So we go from Cuba to the U.S. We were so close to Miami, you could see the lights from the shore. The men were the U.S. policy, they had a Coast Guard cutter following the St. Louis. Morgenthau claimed that it was, the Jewish Secretary of Defense. He given that it was there, just in case we got lost. But the problem was that the men were committing suicide because they were afraid we were heading back to Nazi Germany because we couldn't get into Cuba. We sent 2 telegrams to Roosevelt. He ignored them both. We wanted amnesty. He wouldn't give us amnesty. We had to leave the U.S., go to Canada. Mackenzie King, he was even worse. He hated the Jews. He wouldn't let us in. He was the Prime Minister of Canada at the time. So we couldn't get in there. Thank God for Schrader. He stalled out on the way back to going to Europe as we're heading back to Germany. One of our Jewish agencies was able to get 4 countries to take the Jews off the boat. So we ended up, there was England, there was France, there was Belgium, and there was Holland. We ended up in Holland. It was kind of by random that there's a different story why our family ended up in Holland. Some said it was because the Queen, they wanted families with babies. I was only 6 months old at the time. But I think the real story why we ended up in Holland was because their policy was that they wanted to take the Jews that already were ready to get into the U.S. if their number came up. So they figured they would take those Jews, and the other countries had to take the infirm, the disabled, the rest. So as far as the after effects of that, England, everybody was saved that ended up there. But when you get to France, you get to Belgium, you get to Holland, that's when Hitler invaded all those countries. And a lot of the Jews that ended up in those countries from the St. Louis parish. So after all of that, we end up in Milwaukee in February of 1940.
So why Milwaukee?
Excuse me? Well, in order to get in the U.S., you had to have a sponsor. And we happened to have a cousin who owned Fried Osterman. It was the Osterman family that was related to my family, and they became our sponsors. So what they agreed to do was give us a job so we wouldn't become a public ward. It was the same thing. They, wanted to be sure that you could have enough money to pay for rent, pay for your food, that you have a job where you can make an income and that kind of thing. So my father, when we came over, he started at the factory at Fried Osterman making parachutes. And then he went to night school to learn the language. He had to learn better English because he was a salesperson. So when he finally learned the language well enough, first job was J.C. Penney in Milwaukee, selling in the men's coat department. You know what happened to him? He got fired when they found out he was a Jew. That was back in about 1947. We ended up at Sears. Then he ended up, when they had new management come in, change their policy, and he ended up being the top salesman in the penny chain in the country. But unfortunately, he had a stroke there on Thanksgiving, so that weekend he died at 50. That left my mother very young and a widow, having to raise 2 kids, myself and my brother. And I'll tell you, my mother was, when you come from money and you lose it and you get no money, we had a department store, her family, so she came from money. She had over here we ended up with, we left Germany with $10. That's all you could take with you. Everything else was turned over to the German government. The Nazis, they took all of our insurance policies, they took all of our property, they took all of the department, everything. My book we got the department store from my grandfather on my mother's side, and my father's side, he had the smarts enough to know that after the economic boycott in 1933 already, that things were going to go bad for the Jews in Germany, and he sold his store. But when we left Germany, he felt he was too old to go with us. So he stayed, and of course he died in the Holocaust. And then you got on my mother's side, her parents, he didn't think Hitler was going to last. There was a generation there of older Jews that felt, Hitler was he was going to disappear. He wasn't going to last. He was so awful. You figure it was just, going to be for a short while, and then everything would be better again. So they wouldn't leave either. And their story, after things got really bad, you get to 42, 43, they were deported finally from Innsbruck, and they ended up going to Minsk on one of the railway cars the deportees were put in when they were sent to all of the camps where they were all murdered, and that's what happened to them. On the way there, we don't know what really happened to them. Either the train stopped in the forest, took all of the Jews out of the rail cars and took them in the forest and just murdered them right there, or they got to Minsk, and then they murdered them in Minsk. And at that time when they murdered them, it was really the awful way. It was horrible enough when you got to Auschwitz with the gas chambers, with how they did it early on. They'd line them up in a field, and they had to dig a hole, and then they would put them around the hole, and then they shot them in the hole. And once they had that first lining in, then they put the lime in, and then they'd shoot the next gunshot. And that's the way they killed the Jews at that time. So that's what happened to my grandparents on that side of the story. So that's the story of St. Louis. Now let's go forward to what happened during my civil rights days in Madison, so you know a little bit about
I have a question.
Go ahead.
So, a couple questions.
Yeah.
So, what was the deal here in America at the time that was so hard to get a visa or for Jewish refugees?
Well,
we often think of ourselves as a nation of refugees. So what's the deal?
Very much like today, isolationism. We don't want anybody to be an immigrant in our country. In the U.S., you had Lindbergh, you had Father Conklin, you had all these anti-Semites that had power in this country that didn't want anything to do with the Jews. And that's why Roosevelt had a very, very difficult time. Remember, we were entering World War II. U.S. was not getting ready to fight in World War II. And he had a very tough time with Congress. And he didn't want to expend any clout that he had with the Congress by wasting it on a bunch of Jews,
It's really interesting if you go to the National Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. There's a whole section about the State Department and their opposition to the Jews, which is it's fantastic that that's in this exhibit, but it's really shocking. This is a federal museum, and yet they're talking about the culpability of the United States. So
Let me tell you on that point, the State Department, Roosevelt appointed Breckinridge Long in 1941 to be head of the immigration, and he's the one that sent the memoir to all of the ambassadors in all of the countries in Europe and said, if the Jews come for any kind of visa and they want to get out, stall, stall, stall. That was the policy of the State Department. Roosevelt, not good for the Jews. I mean, a lot of people think he was okay. I don't think so.
And it's funny because the anti-Semites call him Rosenfeld,
Well,
as though he's not Jewish. But
he wasn't. He believe me, he had a difficult time, and he did some wonderful things. Got us out of the depression. Got none of those that were victims of the depression will ever forget what Roosevelt did. That when it comes to what he did for the Jews, you know, the big question, you know, they talk about that they should have bombed Auschwitz. Two sides to that story. Would have saved a lot of lives.
If they bombed the trains.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. But at the same time, the Jews didn't want them to bomb Auschwitz because there were so many Jews that were there, and they were hoping some of them would survive. So it wasn't. It was a debatable question. But the point I want to make of what wasn't debatable, the immigration laws, 2% of the country. Of the immigration that you were coming from. That was the number that would be allowed in the country. So to get a visa. Germany, there was only 18,000, 20,000 visas that were actually issued, but you had the possibility of another 2,000-3,000 more that should have been given out. They had unfulfilled the quotas that they set for the number of Jews that come in from 34 to 37. They never gave out all of the visas that were authorized. And that to me was inexcusable. We got ours in 1938, and that was the first year that all of the ones that were allowed to be issued were actually fulfilled by the State Department. But the other 3 years before, they never allowed all of the Jews to come in that should have been allowed to come in. And there was no excuse for that. There's no way Roosevelt can get away and not say that that policy should have been different. Some of the other criticisms of Roosevelt are debatable. But that one I can't forgive him for. Because if they would have filled all the quotas, a lot of Jews would have been saved. So that was the policy that he had.
Do you think that this experience of your family, what was it that inspired?
Well, that was the inspiration. You know, as I grew up and heard the stories from my mother, never again. You know, it was ingrained in my soul that what happened to the Jews. So when I got out of undergraduate school and went to law school, I was going to be a lawyer that was going to be a civil rights, human rights lawyer. Just never happened again. I was going to fight and make sure that it never did happen again the best I could.
Well, tell us about your life at UW.
Well, okay. So now we're going to get into how did I get into I told you about being the president of the civil rights. So the first case that comes to me, George Mossey, who is the leading Holocaust historian in Madison.
I studied with him too, by the way.
All right, then you know him.
Yeah.
He got in touch with me. A swastika was painted on the pier of Tower View by the Kappa Sigma fraternity right next door. He asked me to investigate, find out who did it. How do I know it was the Kappa Sigma? Because when I investigated it, the girls at Tower View told me they used to sing "Every Jew's a Dirty Jew." When the Hillel Academy was built in Madison, the new one, you're not talking right around the 50s when that happened. They have a cornerstone laying ceremony. It's going to be a big deal for the new Kappa Sigma steal the cornerstone. So the next morning when they have the ceremony, no cornerstone. So, you know, they think that's a prank, you know, funny. So that was another, but the most critical piece of evidence that came up was that I had affidavits from people that they had entered a float in the homecoming parade that was the same color as the swastika that was painted on the pier. So wasn't that evidence good enough? Well, guess what happened? They complained to the police. They told them that. But they had a float in that was the same color. Yeah, they didn't keep the samples. The samples got destroyed. So you couldn't prove it. So what happens when I make a complaint for some of the young ladies that were at Tower View, that were victims. Albion was, I think, the president at the time. He puts Luberg, the dean, and we have a meeting with them. I go into the representative from Anti-Defamation League. I go to the lawyer for Tower View. There's me, the three of us. Luberg looks at me. He says, "Well, what's your evidence?" So I tell him what the evidence is, and what's the response of the fraternity? Who are the names of the people that did it? I said, well, I asked Kappa Sigma people. They can tell you who they are, right? Who knows better than them? Well, you know how far that got me. So case went out the window. They dismissed it because of that reason. There are a couple of things that come out of that situation. Tower View's position was they didn't want to make a big stink. They didn't want attention drawn to the problem. So they were willing to let it go. Don't let Jacobson create a big problem here for us. And then when you get the lawyer for, when you get the Anti-Defamation League, and their position is, if the client doesn't want anything done, we don't want anything done either. So that was the end of it. So they dismissed the thing. Well, when that was over, the next thing happens, and this is when I met Lloyd Barbie. He was the president of the state emergency conference branches in the state of Wisconsin. And they had a housing bill. Isaac Coggs, the only black legislator, introduced a fair housing bill in the state of Wisconsin. They could not get it out of the committee that it was bottled up in. So Barbie calls me, gets together, and he says, can you come up with something to raise a little bit of tumult about, so we can draw attention to the problem. So I said, sure, I'll be glad to help you out. So I go up to the Capitol to try to figure out what would come up with. Those of you that have been in the state capitol, you're aware of the rotunda, the area where you first enter. There's 16 pillars that surround the rotunda. So what comes to mind that I would come up with thinking, oh, what could we do here to raise a little tumult to get this bill out of this committee? We can all walk in with folding chairs, 16 of us. We can put ourselves right in front of those pillars. The legislature's got to see us every time they come into the state capitol. They'll know what we're here for. And we'll stay here 24 hours and not leave as long as it takes until that bill gets reported out of the committee. We were there for, well, then we got a little problem. Barbie tells me, first he loved the idea. He gets everybody to approve it in the NAACP in the state. So they all say, yeah, we'll have to sit in the state capitol. So what happens when we get the sit-in going and all the Governor Nelson, Gaylord Nelson, governor at the time, you're welcome, we're going to let you have your sit-in, but when the capitol closes at 6 o'clock, if you don't leave, we're going to arrest all of you. Well, I had a lot of macho guys that wanted to sit in until Gaylord Nelson said he was going to arrest all of them if we stayed past when it closed. All my macho friends, all of a sudden they disappeared. So we had to come up with 16 people that were willing to sit in and get arrested. So I always have a pretty good idea how to handle these kind of situations. So I go to the rescue mission, I get a couple of guys, tell them I'm going to give you a paper wrap, little thing that you guys like to have, but you got to sit in. And when it closes, you got to stay there. And then I told her, we're all going to be arrested. So we had 16. And
were you one of those 16?
Of course, Barbie and I were the two that we were leading the whole thing. So of course we were going to sit in. If you don't participate, you can't be just a talker. There's some of us that do more than just talk. So we were sitting there, and when the Capitol closes, all of a sudden Joe Nussbaum, who is assistant to Gaylord, comes down and he says, all of you that are sitting can stay. We're not going to arrest you. Nobody else can join you as long as we're closed. You can all leave whenever you want to, but nobody else can come in until we open up again. and then people can come in. And of course, the 16 of us slept on the floor all night. And then when it opened up, other people joined the sit-in, and Janet Lee, Governor Nelson's sister, joined it. That gave it a stamp of it was okay to join it. And, you don't have to be afraid you're going to get arrested. We have university professors. We have Carlo. For 13 days, there were over 800 people sat in, totally peaceful, no problems, nobody, a lot of harassment, but nothing violent or anything. Tell a little story. Darwin Spoon represented, he was a lobbyist for the real estate lobby. He comes in, and, they were the worst when it came to fair housing, the real estate lobby. Nothing for the blacks, much less the Jews. No open housing in the state of Wisconsin. When he comes in, he looks in the center, and I'm looking at him, and he looks at me, and he says, "What's going on here? You guys having a long-distance crafting?" These lobbyists, they have a lot of class, right? So that was his response to what was going on. The sit-in ended up after 13 days because the bill did get reported out of the committee at that time. One black, Isaac Coggs, that was the only vote for fair housing in the state of Wisconsin. Everybody else voted against it. That was the second thing. Then we had a third thing where I was involved with Barbie. We did a candid film showing, we had testers going out to try and rent and purchase housing in the black community in Madison. 13 different incidents, all black testers. We're doing this through a candid technique in a van with a camera. We're filming each of these incidents. In every one of the 13 instances, blacks were denied. Either they couldn't rent or they couldn't purchase. The white follow-ups, they got to rent, they got to buy. So that film, we had the University of Wisconsin Audiovisual Department. They agreed to co-sponsor this film. We showed it to them. It was so dramatic. They looked at one another. They brought in the university people that were the powers that be. This will give Madison such a terrible reputation if they see how much racism there is in the community. This film is not going to be shown. You have to get reenacted people to go and play those parts, and you cannot show the bigots that wouldn't let them rent the properties or buy the properties. Then, of course, I'm there always giving a helpful suggestion. Whether you're worried about that and you want to put a reenacted film in where you can't recognize any of the bigots, put them in blackface. Well, you can imagine what happened. That film ended up being put in the archives and wasn't shown for 60 years. 60 years that film was not shown to the public. Hanish, who was the guy from the audiovisual department that was involved with it, he resigned over that. I put together a little protest in front of the law school. We protest film burning. I was very popular in law school. But I did get out, and I got my degree. So I was, legit when I started practicing law. So that was, and after that, Barbie then comes and talks to me. I'm ready to graduate, and he says, "Look, the end of this, if he wants me to go to Milwaukee, open up a law office, bring the lawsuit to desegregate the schools." He said, "I want you to be my partner and come with me." I had to think long and hard about that. So I contacted all my people that I know in Milwaukee. "Oh, it's such a wonderful thing. You want to do this? You're the first integrated law firm, and I think it's so great. We all want, but you shouldn't be the first one to do it." And of course, I was always the contrarian. So off we go, and we open up our office, Barbie and Jacobson, 1962 May. We ended up on 26th and Fond du Lac. That's where we had our office, in Bob Miller's little real estate establishment. We each had our little office there, and that's where we practiced law. Out of that came the civil rights cases that we got involved in. We started with the Negro American Labor Council, then we had Milwaukee Corps. Negro American Labor Council was Calvin Sherrard. They were picketing AMP to get blacks jobs as meat cutters, which is a good job. All the blacks had the lousy jobs. Retail clerks, they were against what we were trying to do. It was against union seniority policies. Blacks were the last hired, first fired. They didn't want them to be able to skip the line. Don't give them any preference. They were against what we were advocating, that you got to put some blacks in these better jobs. You know, they got to wait their turn. And they were always last if they had any seniority at all. Couldn't get jobs in those days for blacks. So that was the first protest. Then there came a protest with Milwaukee Court and Gibbons. That was the Lynn's, where he's on a big commission that's supposed to be working with social issues in the community in Milwaukee. In the first meeting, he said, well, you know, the blacks, they all have an IQ of 0. You know, they come up here from the South and, you know, they all drink and they're alcohol and they're making all these public statements. Core, of course, at that time, they went out and started demonstrating. First at the courthouse, it was the day before the March on Washington in 1963. That was when we had the first picket line there. I'm sitting in the library waiting to see what's going to happen if it get a little out of hand and any problems. Second day, they moved from in front of the courthouse into the office of the head of the county board, Grobschmidt. They have a sit-in, and they all got arrested. John Gibbons. That was a big. So that was the first case I tried. Then the next came another group came from the March on Washington, and, you know, inspired by Martin Luther King. I have a dream. I mean, you can imagine when they come back and they hear, well, you can take a stand for civil rights now. Go down to the courthouse, join the demonstration. 13 more people get arrested. Out of that, there was a black Eleanor McCready. She was from St. Louis. She was waiting to get in the Peace Corps. She comes down to demonstrate in Milwaukee. She gets arrested in the city of Milwaukee. That was the second case I tried. They left one black. DeBrozo was the DA. He was so confident after I lost the first case, he left the black on this one. And so we got one black, and that jury got this case to decide it. It's the only case of the sit-ins, and there were lots of people arrested that the jury found not guilty. And when I went to talk to her after we got the verdict, she said, I told them, if you don't vote to acquit them, you're going to be here to help these stores. And they got the ones that didn't want to change their vote, they wanted to go home. It was the weekend. They changed their vote. Not guilty. Don't tell me having a black on the jury doesn't make a difference in a civil rights case. And when it's all white, you lose every case you try. You lose every case you try. You only win them on appeal. So that was what happened. And
so we're actually starting to run out of time, and I still have a couple of questions.
Let me just cover a couple of the big ones. The big one was when McGrappy got arrested during the housing marches. That case I took to the United States Supreme Court. He was arrested for disorderly conduct. We lose at the trial level, both, you know, county court, circuit court, Supreme Court. Supreme Court takes the case. What happened in that case, I brought a motion to change venue, get it out of Milwaukee County. I didn't think they could get first trial. Duffy was the lawyer, the judge. You know, fortunately, we had judges like Duffy, and we had Krieger was on the bench, and we had this kind of judges. When it came to any kind of motions for civil rights, you lose them all. But the reasoning, they were so bigoted and racist that the reasoning that they gave, that you got it up on appeal after that, you had a shot at winning. In this case, what happened with the change of venue case, it was only in felonies, not misdemeanors, that the U.S. Wisconsin Supreme Court said you could have it. And I said it doesn't make any difference if you go to jail for 1 day or if you go to jail for over a year. You got to give them a chance to get a fair trial. And that is what the U.S. Supreme Court took the case on and overturned that decision. They found that Wisconsin changed the venue law of the Constitution. At the same time, I tried what I consider one of the most important cases I ever tried. I challenged Wisconsin's law on garnishment before judgment. I had a client that was garnished by a credit clothing store. It was a 14-year time period from when he supposedly signed the contract and when they decided to sue him, with interest, with all kinds of things added on. He was in Korea at the time that contract was supposed to have been signed. David Jennings was the judge. He's a very white patrician, you know, elitist kind of a judge, right? Had a little bow tie. He decided, first he wasn't going to sign the order where I said, I want this law declared unconstitutional. I want you to give me an order to show cause, and I'm going to challenge that law. And he looked at me, "You think I'm going to sign something like that?" I said, "You're crazy." Well, I researched. You could get sanctions against them if they don't sign, if you present a valid order to them for the sign. I showed it to him. He went back in his chambers. He must have called his lawyer, told you better sign it. He signed it. Then what happened? They wouldn't give me the contract that I wanted. He kept adjourning it, and he kept writing. We were waiting for over 4 months. It comes to Christmas, he couldn't get anything for his kids. You know, all the money was tied up in the garnishment. And I'm thinking, and that's how it was, that terrible a situation where the light went on in my head. I said, well, this isn't fair. There's got to be something I can do. And it's a denial of due process when you take property without having a hearing first. And that was the challenge under the 14th. And that was, of course, we lost all the way up until we got through the Wisconsin Supreme Court. They lost, and then I got it into the U.S. Supreme Court in New York. It was a shock to everybody. I couldn't get Marquette law professors, Wisconsin law professors, to work with me on the brief that I wanted to file because they thought it was futile. Only the court can, decide the law. The legislature's got to do it. It can't be the judges. U.S. Supreme Court threw out garnishment 2 times in the U.S. Supreme Court, and we won them both. And I'm very proud of that. So that takes care of that period.
Yeah. So I'm sure people would like to know something about the Jeffrey Dahmer case. I mean,
Well, let me briefly touch on that.
Yeah. Briefly, yes.
Yeah. I don't want to get into that one so much. I'd rather open it up to questions.
I have one more question after
Okay.
this.
Here's what I did for the Dahmer people. They came to me. I ended up with 8 families. How I got so many cases? The first case I put in the complaint when I sued Jeffrey Dahmer, $3 billion that I wanted. And that got the attention of the press. The headlines, Dahmer sued for $3 billion. Lots of families didn't know what lawyer they should go to get justice for what happened to their victim family members. And now they see a headline that some guy sued Jeffrey Dahmer for $3 billion. You better call. I ended up with 8 families. So what we did was we went up to Columbia Correctional, took a deposition of Dahmer. First I took out a judgment for over $100 million for all his families. And then I went to see Dahmer and I said, how are you going to pay this? You know, he claimed he had 2 nickels to every. Well, you know his story. Oh, I'd do it if I could, but, I just don't have anything. I got busted out. I don't have any money. I'd like to do the right thing, but I can't. I said, well, I can help you maybe do the right thing. Let me give you a suggestion of how you could come up with some money to pay the families. Why don't you write a book, and we'll video it when you talk about how you got to be the way you are and what you did. And that book will get us millions. And he looks at me and he says, I don't think that kind of book would be worth anything. And I don't think I want to do something like that. His father gets all the money. He sues. He writes the book, so he gets the advance of $150 grand, takes all the money. So Dahmer wouldn't do it. Basically, he wouldn't assign it to that. But I'm questioning him. I find out he's got $12,000 in a bank account. He thinks that's a small amount of money. I'm looking at him like, you get 13 cents an hour doing license plates and you're working. How'd you get $12,000 in your bank account? People send me money for all around the world. He ends up with $12,000, so we garnish all that money. But the big ticket came when I'm asking about what kind of property he owned. He's got an AM radio, he's got this, he's got that, he's got books, he's got all of a sudden I'm looking at him, I said, that's Jeffrey Dahmer stuff, right? And he says, yeah, well, that's all I got, just that kind of stuff and what I had in my apartment. And then I'm on thinking, well, there's an inventory that I saw at the police. They put everything that was in your apartment, about 22 different items. You own all that stuff. That's all your property. Why don't you give that to us? And I'll sell it to the sickos out there that might be interested in something like this. And I think we can raise a lot of money. Well, he didn't think that was such a good idea either. So it ends up, I do go after that property. And I had to go through the courts. It took me 2 years to convince the judge that he should give me everything. Well, everything meant everything in the apartment, and I don't want to tell you the kind of stuff in that apartment that I thought was going to get the big bucks. But suffice it to say, when we got all that stuff, and it happened at the time that the Kennedy family, they did their auction. You remember when the kids sold up and it got 20, 50, $100 million? Of course, I come out and say, well, that's Camelot. Now let's find out what the flip side is. Dahmer is the opposite of Camelot. We'll have a Dahmer auction to raise money. Well, you can imagine how the press treated that kind of a suggestion. I mean, the press crucified me. They went after me for all of it. You know, it was blood money, and it was this, and it was that, and it's horrible, and he wants to perpetuate. And, you know, he's going to get a lawyer's cut, and he's coming up with these ideas. One of them said we should put him on a trail and send him out of town. Let's ship him out of town. That's the kind of response we got. I mean, the press just killed me with all that stuff. And it was always, you know, the big thing was, and then it's the lawyer's cut. The lawyer's going to get most of that money. You know, it's all about I'm the guy that's causing all the trouble. You know, nothing about victim rights here. Well, thank God for Joe Zilber. We got him involved. He was willing to buy it all, gave us $500,000, and that went to 11 families. They all got an equal share. I didn't take a fee. I never took a fee representing any of the civil rights people I represented. Grappy, all the cases I told you about. I did it all pro bono. That's what you call pro bono. And I think we really made a difference. I think we really did. I think out of what we did, we kept a lot of people from going to jail. We changed a lot of bad things from happening. We gave a lot of money to victim families for what Dahmer happened to Dahmer. And that's my story.
So
now you can go ahead and open it up the question.
I do have one more question, and maybe somebody will ask the question, but, you know, I mean, here you are, you fought your whole life to make America a better place. You stood up for the underdog. You're really part of history. And so if you could make some comments about what you see in America today. You know, and you know, after a whole lifetime of fighting for the underdog.
Well, I can tell you it's a scary time. It's beyond belief. I never felt things could be this bad. I think they're going to get worse. If you look at what happened in Nazi Germany, how authoritarian fascism, how it all developed, we're following the same path on Trump. After authoritarianism, we're going to have fascism. He's gone after all the institutions. He's got the Justice Department as his own private law firm. You've got the Supreme Court in his pocket, and you've got Congress that he controls. So all the Republicans are all part of the Dahmer team, and so all the power is in his hands, and he's going to exercise it. And all we can do is stand up and protest. You've got to stand up and you've got to resist. The book says resist, resist. I'm going to sign you any books that you purchase here today, and it's going to be resist, resist, resist. That's going to be my message. I'm going to sign it for you, and I'm going to give you a deal, by the way. If you get the soft cover book, it's $15. If you buy the hardcover book, it's $20. That's the deal today. So if you want to get the book, you can get it on the website, Amazon website. It's under Underdog, my name. That's how it works.
So great. So I do want to spend a few minutes if you guys have questions. Here we have a question in the front row.
Gus, right?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
I was at the University of Wisconsin Milwaukee today, and I was studying the history of sundown towns in Wisconsin, and I was specifically looking at the maps of racial segregation in Milwaukee County and Wisconsin at large. And I referenced James Lowen's book, Sundown Towns, and his chapter where he talks so much about Wisconsin. He said specifically across the United States, African Americans are still understandably wary of towns with white in their names, such as Whitesboro, Texas, White City, Kansas, Whitehall, Arkansas, Whitefish Bay, Wisconsin, and White Landland, Whitetown, and White County, Indiana. And again, all the foregoing communities probably kept African Americans out. So have a number of towns named for idealistic concepts, eventually Illinois, New Harmony, Indiana. And he goes on, but he talks so much about Wisconsin and this area even specifically with the deliberate effort. And I thought, wow, related to what you said about the housing efforts and how it was so staunch that we're not going to pass fair housing because we are dedicated to white supremacy? Like, what, even in this area specifically, like, what was your experience with housing in this area in Milwaukee County, which is notorious for its hyper segregation?
Well, blacks and Jews weren't welcome. That's the bottom line. You had restricted covenants keeping Jews out for the longest time, and then you have policy blacks they couldn't rent, and you didn't have a fair housing bill. So yeah, in these communities, blacks and Jews and minorities weren't welcome. You couldn't get housing. You couldn't get in these communities. It got better after a while. Not great, but it got better. But we're the most highly community in the country.
Well,
Wisconsin is the most hyper. It's the most hyper. Milwaukee is the most hyper segregated city in the country.
And yet the fair housing demonstrations here and your involvement had changed history in America. Isn't that a big part of the Fair Housing Act in Congress?
65, you got the Fair Housing Act. Johnson signed it. A lot of that, he was wonderful when it came to that kind of thing. And, and that came about because of Martin Luther King and the kind of demonstration. Let me tell you, and this is one of the messages I tell people when I speak. When you get involved in any kind of demonstrations and protests, you're trying to change people's opinions. You're trying to change horrendous policies that discriminate against people. When you protest nonviolently. Do not engage in violence. Do not confront police officers. Don't agitate. You may be frustrated. You may be upset. But if you want to change, and if you're out there to try and get change, do it in a way you can change people's opinion that you're trying to reach. The people that aren't on one side extreme against you. They've got those feelings that you can't change their mind, but you got to get those that still have an open mind, and you can't get it if you engage in violence. That will turn them off. So you've got to be nonviolent. That's Martin Luther King, always nonviolent. He never was violent. Never had his followers do any kind of violence. No confrontation. Nothing there to agitate the police. You don't want to do that. They'll do it by themselves. Don't worry about it. You don't have to be the one that. They'll be the ones that are going to egg you on and come after you. That's what's happening in LA today. We want to bring it up to date. Let's take a look. It's about a mile downtown that all the problems occurred. There weren't that many. I mean, if you saw any of the TV, Fox kept running the car that was burning, the Waymo car that they set on fire. And they always focused on, when you get the confrontation between the protesters, throwing something at the cops, and the cops react, and then they go after them, and that kind of thing. That's what they show everybody. The Fox audience. They don't see the nonviolence that's going on. In LA, all the rest of the state of California where the protests, there was no problem. It was only that 1 mile area. But you can't engage in violence. You can't do it if you want to change people's opinion. And you got first, when you saw that senator get thrown out of the office of Christy Nolan, he was acting out of frustration. He was upset. Why is these families in the Hispanic community, the male working in these places like Home Depot, who did the ICE go after for masks and arrest? Take them out of those places of employment and deported them. And the family members, they're left without the winter in their family. Sure. The criminal people that came in that didn't do it legally, that's one thing going after them. But he's going after all of the people that came in. They aren't legal. They did come illegal, but when they came in, they all got jobs, and they did the jobs nobody else wanted. These are the people that would do your yard work. They would be the ones that you use in your domestic kind of jobs that you needed to have done, that nobody else would do, that you relied on the help. They would help you with it. They took care of the children. You had those kind of minority people taking care of your babies. Those households were ripped apart by ICE, by the men being taken out and deported. And that was that frustration of those kind of people, and that senator who's representing those people. And he couldn't even ask a question during a press conference. And he did identify himself. If you saw it on TV, you heard him say, "I'm a senator, and I'm here, I want to ask you a question." And she claims he never identified himself, live on Fox TV, and that's all they played. So the people that only watch Fox, that's the only thing they heard. Here comes in this guy, he doesn't identify himself. She claims he was trying to attack her, and that she had to be saved by her security. I mean,
all anyone needs to do is to see the footage of it. So, does anyone else have questions? One in the back there, yes.
All right. My question is kind of sensitive. I know it's going to be sensitive, but I say this with the utmost passion and desire for a Jewish future. But I'm wondering how it feels to watch what's unfolding in Gaza after your experience, in the.
Okay, it's a very touchy, but I got to tell you, I support Israel, and why do I support Israel? Because without Israel as a homeland, Jews have nowhere to go. And who's the best example of that? Me. I was on the St. Louis. Nobody wanted the Jews on the St. Louis because we were Jewish. That's why they wouldn't let us. We had no country we could go to. We would have all gone back to Germany and put in the gas chambers. If you don't have a stake where you're welcome, you're going to be toast, literally. So I don't like a lot of the things that Netanyahu does. I think he's got those fascists in his government that allow him to stay as prime minister. They want trouble. They want nothing but trouble. It's awful. But I can't be against Israel, the state of Israel. I've got to support the state. Any Jew has to support the state of Israel. You don't have to be a Zionist. You don't have to be for Netanyahu. But you've got to support the state of Israel. You've got to do that. You got to have a homeland. Somewhere where you're welcome. That's my view.
Any other questions?
I just wanted to say quickly with regards to blacks and Jews not being welcome. They spent so much time with me at the library today, going through the covenant specifically. I did not see one covenant that said blacks and Jews, and they picked out a bunch for me. I even have one here that's written for Whitefish Bay at 609 North Berkeley Boulevard. It says, "At no time shall any portion of said real estate or any improvements erected thereon be occupied by or sold, conveyed, mortgaged, pledged, rented, or leased in whole or in part to any person of Negro or Ethiopian descent, provided, however," that is, and it goes on about they can be a servant.
What's happened is those kind of restrictions have now been found to be unenforceable. Early days they were enforceable, but they have now changed policies where they don't allow those kind of restrictive covenants to be enforced.
Really? Okay. Oh, and I will. They were lovely enough to give me a map of the demographic of Wisconsin on the whole. It's not even just Whitefish Bay. It's really all of Wisconsin. People like me are basically stuck in Milwaukee County. And I mean, it's staggering. They have one black person in many places. Even, in fact, we looked just if you cross to Thingsville, it goes from a place where you have a large concentration of black people to 0 black people if you just cross one street. That is, and they said the same thing at the library. That is massively intentional.
Let me tell you something. If you have a restrictive enforcement, restrictive kind of contract like that to keep black and Jews out today, Mark McSweeney, who's one of the best lawyers we've got in the state of Wisconsin, he'll make sure that kind of a restrictive is not going to be enforced. It's unconstitutional and it'll be thrown out. And if he can't do it alone, I'll come back and help. I still got my law license. I can still practice law. Can't be enforced today. If I had that case, it would never get enforced.
So, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to listen to you.
I want to thank all of you for coming. I really appreciate it. I know many of you personally. I've known many of you for many, many years. I'm going to tell you, I took this book tour. I started here in Milwaukee yesterday, I'll be at Juneteenth Day tomorrow, and I'll be going up to Madison Thursday and Friday to finish up this tour. And it's been phenomenal. We've gotten a great response to books. People have really been very receptive to buying these kind of books. This book. I'm not interested. Really, what I wanted to do is get the book out so I can get the message out. I think it's a historical book. I think people have to know what the real story is of what went down in St. Louis, civil rights in Milwaukee, through 58 to 1970. That was the period when many of these cases I've been talking about occurred. That was the worst period. That was when we had the awakening of people that would not allow these kind of things to happen anymore. In the demonstrations, people stood up and started protesting to get these kind of things you're talking about, not to be enforced, be declared unconstitutional. That's what I did back in those days. I'll do it again today if I have to. You know, they cannot do it anymore. As bad as these courts are, we're still going to be able to get those kind of cases successfully handled. And they are not going to be able to get away with the kind of overt restrictive policies that they were able to do in the old days. It's not going to be that way anymore. That's my prediction.
So I'm sure if you want to talk to Tom, who's around, there's still food. And thank you all so much for coming.
Boy, you're ready to go here.
Oh, I just talked about this today, literally for hours, and looking at it on the map. But I will say there was not one covenant, and we looked at all of them on the map for Whitefish Bay. Not one mentioned Jews. It was just black people. It didn't even mention other non-white people. It didn't say anything about Latinos or Asians. It was just black people.
Nigga, you so brainwashed. I'm a victim, brother. No problem. You're a victim. Yeah. I'm a victim of 400 years of conditioning. Shut up. The man has programmed my conditioning. Mm-hmm. Even my conditioning has been conditioned.